If our life is what our thoughts make it, then the stories we run repeated daily, mostly unexamined, are not simply describing our lives, they're quietly building them, which is either rather alarming or genuinely liberating, depending entirely whether you have read the story lately and asked whether it's still true.
Just keep moving on the track. Take the steady path, keep it moving slow. Every step you take is the way you grow. Take the steady path, let the rhythm guide. One step at a time to the other side.
Here's a story you'll recognise. Therapist's office in Boston. A man in his mid-40s sits across from the most frustrating patient he's ever had. The patient is 20 years old, and he's also, by some distance, the cleverest person in the building. At night, mopping the corridors of MIT, he stops at a chalkboard, picks up the chalk, and quietly solves a problem the professor had set as a challenge to his graduate students. He works there as a janitor. He can take a psychologist apart in about 5 minutes, and he's already done it to 5 of them before this one. And underneath all of it, he's carrying something very heavy. The therapist is played by Robin Williams, the young man by Matt Damon. The film is, of course, Good Will Hunting, directed by Gus Van Sant, 1997. It's not his genius that's holding Will back, it's the story. The story he's been telling himself since childhood. The story that says, "You're the kid nobody wanted." The story that says, "Everyone who gets close enough will eventually hurt you or leave." The story that says, "Don't let them see what you really have because they'll use it against you." Sean has been circling that story for weeks, and then he stops circling, he looks at Will, and he says 4 words. "It's not your fault." Will deflects. Sean says it again. Will tries to laugh it off. Sean doesn't move. Will gets angry, and Sean says it again. And then slowly something gives way, and he cries, and a story 20 years old, worn smooth by repetition, loosens just a little. That is what today's episode is about. The stories we tell ourselves. Where they come from, what they cost us, and because we always make this practical, what you can actually do about them. There's a voice in your head. You already knew that. But here's what's worth stopping for. This voice has been running so long and speaks with such a casual authority that most of us never stop to ask who it is, where it came from, or whether it's actually telling us the truth. Because it's a neutral voice. It's not a reporter giving you the facts. It's a narrator. And a narrator has a version of events. Yours might say, "I'm not academic enough," or "I've never been good with money," or "I'm the kind of person who starts things but never finishes them," or, and this was one that I hear a lot, "I'm just not the kind of person who plans ahead." None of those is a fact. They're all stories. They may feel like facts, and they may have been reinforced over the years by experiences that seem to confirm them, but they are stories. And the brilliant thing about a story, it can be rewritten. The trouble is, most of us never notice we're running one in the first place. Back to Will Hunting for a moment, because the film shows quite plainly how a self-protective story works. Will's story was built in childhood under circumstances he didn't choose and didn't deserve. A difficult foster system, adults who failed him, a world that gave him very early every reason to believe that letting people in was the surest route to being hurt. And so his mind, brilliant, fast, efficient, built a story around that experience. Trust no one, show no one the real thing, keep the genius hidden, keep the heart hidden, and if someone gets close enough to threaten the walls, destroy them before they destroy you. That is, on its own terms, a completely logical response to an impossible situation. Which is the uncomfortable truth about most of the stories we carry. They weren't invented for no reason. They were built at some point to protect us. The story, "I'm not good enough," was perhaps built by a child who needed some way to explain why a parent was absent or critical. The story, "I mustn't want too much," was perhaps built by someone who watched wanting lead to disappointment, and decided that wanting less was simply the safer option. The stories made sense once, they just never got updated. And then we find ourselves at 43 sitting across from a therapist or a financial planner or a very honest friend, still running a piece of thinking we built at 8 years old and wondering why things don't quite work the way they should. There's another category worth naming: the stories we didn't build ourselves at all, the one we were simply handed. Think about the film Working Girl, 1988. Mike Nichols, Melanie Griffith plays Tess McGill, a secretary from Staten Island who rides the ferry into Manhattan every morning, works in mergers and acquisitions at a firm called Petty Marsh, and has a business degree she earned at night school because night school was the only route ever realistically open to her. Tess is not short of ability. She reads properly, she notices things, and she puts together a genuinely clever idea that Trask Industries ought to move into radio. She takes it to her boss, Catherine Parker, played by Sigourney Weaver, who is warm, encouraging, and says she'll think about it, then quietly sets about presenting it upstairs as her own. But the part that matters isn't the theft, it's everything around it. It's the way everybody in Tess's world, including, for a long time, Tess herself, has quietly agreed on what a girl from Staten Island is for. She makes the calls, she takes the notes. The ideas come from the corner offices. Nobody says it out loud, nobody has to. It has simply been agreed. That's what an inherited story looks like: a cage with a comfortable lock, because it never feels like unfairness. It feels like realism. I have a head for business and a bod for sin. Is there anything wrong with that? This happens with money more than almost anywhere else. I see it all the time. Stories about money pass through families like furniture, rarely examined, simply assumed. Stories that say, money's for other people, or we don't talk about that sort of thing, or people like us don't take financial risks, or they'll never be quite enough, so hold on tight to what you have. None of those are facts either, but many of them are running quietly in the background every financial decision a person makes for decades without ever being examined. The client who can't bring themselves to invest, even when the numbers make it obvious, because somewhere in the background a quiet voice says, this is not for people like us. The client who can't spend in retirement, even though they've more than earned it, because the story of scarcity has been running so long, it's become indistinguishable from wisdom. The film ends with Tess walking into an office of her own, and for a moment she can't process it. Another woman appears, and Tess assumes she must be the one in charge. She isn't. She's Tess's secretary. That is how long a story runs on after the facts have changed. Then the camera pulls back until her window is one of a thousands in a wall of glass, and Carly Simon starts singing "Let the River Run." The story had simply told her which floor she belonged on. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote this: between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space, the gap between what happens to you and the story you build around it, is where the choice sits. Frankl called it the last human freedom, the freedom to decide what your experience means. And Frankl wrote that having survived a concentration camp, having lost his wife, having had almost everything that could be taken from him taken. What he found in the extremity of that experience was that the story you tell about your circumstances is not fixed. It's not handed to you by the event. It is chosen, even under conditions of extraordinary pain. Most of us are not operating under anything like those conditions, which means we have, if anything, even more room to choose the story than Frankl did. We're just, for the most part, not using it. And it's worth saying that Frankl didn't discover that space. He rediscovered it. 2,000 years earlier, the Stoics had built a whole philosophy on the same idea: that it is rarely the event itself that shapes us, but the story, the judgment, the interpretation we lay over the top of it. It was Epictetus who put it like this: men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them. That's more or less today's episode in that sentence. What happened to you is one thing. The story you tell yourself about what it meant is another. And the second one is yours. And it was Marcus Aurelius who wrote this in Meditations. Our life is what our thoughts make it. Sit with that for a moment. If our life is what our thoughts make it, then the stories we run, repeated daily, mostly unexamined, are not simply describing our lives. They are quietly building them, which is either rather alarming or genuinely liberating, depending entirely on whether you have read the story lately and asked whether it's still true. Daniel Kahneman was a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. His book, or one of his books, is called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's worth a read. His argument is that you're running two systems. System 1 is fast, automatic, and always on. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and, his word not mine, lazy. It only gets out of his chair when it absolutely has to. Kahneman sums up how System 1 works in 7 words. What you see is all there is. That reminds me of Tom Cruise in Cocktail when he says, what you see is what you get. And here's the part that matters to us today. System 1 does not deal in open questions. It deals in stories, and it wants them coherent. Give it 2 or 3 fragments and it hands you back a complete, confident narrative without ever mentioning how thin the evidence was. Someone glances sideways in a meeting, they don't rate you. A statement lands lower than you'd hoped, we're in trouble. A difficult conversation opens, this is over. None of those are conclusions. They aren't even really guesses. They are stories assembled at speed out of almost nothing and handed to you with the authority of a fact. And I'll be honest with you, in my experience, this is where most poor financial decisions come from. Not bad arithmetic, a fast story that nobody went back and checked. Don Miguel Ruiz, in his book The Four Agreements, calls these stories agreements, things we agreed to believe about ourselves and the world at some point, usually without realizing we were signing anything. And the first thing he asks you to do is simply to notice them, not attack them, not try to dismantle them overnight. Just notice. Here is a story I agreed to. Does this agreement still serve me? Is it even still true? Carol Dweck's research on mindset's worth a mention here too. Her book's called Mindset. Her central finding that people who believe their abilities are fixed tend to avoid challenges that might disprove the story, while people who believe abilities can grow tend to actively seek those same challenges, is at its heart an insight about narrative. The fixed mindset is a story. The growth mindset is a different story. And the evidence suggests the second one is both more accurate and more useful. The brain is more adaptable than the story has been giving it credit for. For the music, this episode, because we always do the music, I wanted to start with Tracy Chapman, Fast Car, 1988. A big hit at the time and a song built almost entirely out of stories. A young woman stuck in a life she didn't choose, who keeps telling herself, and the man she loves, the story of the fast car and what it's going to bring. The escape, the new life, the different version of things. You got a fast car, I want a ticket to anywhere, maybe we make a deal. Maybe together we can get somewhere, any place is better. Starting from zero, got nothing to lose, maybe we'll make something. Me, myself, I got nothing to prove. Sorry. I quite like that song. I don't know if you like it, but there you go. The whole song is narrated in a future tense that never quite arrives. First, they'll escape. Then they'll build something. Then the relationship will shift. Then things will be different. Verse after chorus, the story gets told. And by the end, quietly but unmistakably, you understand that the story has been keeping her place at least as much as circumstances has. The fast car was never going to fix it. The story was the problem. And then there's REM, Everybody Hurts, 1992. I'm not going to sing this one. It would make you depressed. Another one everybody knows, and quite a bleak one if we're honest. When you think you've got too much of this life to hang on, when the day is long and the night is yours alone, hold on. What that song does is not try to rewrite your story. It doesn't tell you your story's wrong. It just says you're not the only one running it. Everyone has a version of this. The one where it's too much, the one where the weight of what you're carrying has become briefly unbearable. And the answer is simply hold on. Not forever, just through this moment. Don't let the story in this particular hour make any permanent decisions. That turns out to be rather good advice in quite a few situations. 3 things then, as always, because I know you're busy and you've been very patient with me. Firstly, write the story down. Whatever narrative you're running about yourself, about your abilities, your money, your worth, just write it down as a headline. 1 sentence. What does the voice say when things go wrong? Because the act of putting it on paper begins to create that space Franklin was talking about. You can't revise a story you've never actually read. Second, ask where it came from. Not to blame anyone, just one question. When did I first agree to this? Because the stories built by 8-year-olds to protect 8-year-olds often don't need to be running our lives at 40 years old. They did a job. It's completely fine to let them retire. And third, try a different story. Just once as an experiment. Not permanently, but just this week. If your story says, I'm not the kind of person who plans ahead, try the story that says, I'm learning to plan ahead. Not because it's certainly true, but because the evidence from Dweck, from Frankl, from decades of cognitive science is that the story you choose to tell genuinely shapes the reality you end up inhabiting. Try a better one. See what happens. Write it down. Ask where it came from. Try a different one. That's the whole program. Simple, really. 1 question for the week, just one as always. Ask yourself this. Whose voice is narrating my life? And when did I last check whether it's telling me the truth? Because the voice has been there so long and speaks with such easy familiarity that it's very easy to confuse it with reality. To assume that what it says about who you are, what you deserve, and what is possible for you is simply a description of facts rather than a narrative that could, in principle, be revised. Back to Will Hunting, one last time. At the end of the film, he gets in his car and drives. Not towards the safe, predictable life his story has mapped out for him, but towards something that frightened him. Not because the fear had gone, but because for perhaps the first time he decided the story didn't get to make the choice. That's the invitation here. The story is not the sentence. It's not the truth. It's just the most recent version of something that can quietly, at any point, be rewritten. Thank you for joining me for episode 10 of The Steady Path. I'll see you in the next episode. Until next time, slow down, think clearly, keep walking your steady path. I'm Paul Cleworth. Thanks for listening. Hello, Paul here from The Steady Path. Just letting you know that after episode 10, on the 13th of August, taking a couple of weeks break off over the summer, and we're back September the 3rd for 3 special episodes that are all about Lord of the Rings. So look forward to that. It's Hobbit Day on the 22nd of September, and these 3 special episodes are my sort of love letter to J.R.R. Tolkien and my favourite book, The Lord of the Rings. Until then, thank you very much for listening.